All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's installment of the Discover Tennessee History webinar series, and of course, our first in this series for 2023. So welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Kira Duke with the Teaching with Primary Sources program at MTSU, and I am just going to introduce things for us before I turn things over to our presenters for this month, our friends at the East Tennessee Historical Society. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. We are recording this for inclusion on YouTube for those who might be watching later who couldn't join us as we do this live. So if you would, please keep yourselves muted during the course of the presentation unless the presenters ask you to do otherwise. And then of course, we would like to see you to rename yourself, your first and last name, so we know who we're talking with in the chat. And we do want these sessions to be interactive for those who are joining us live. So again, feel free to use the chat box, introduce yourselves, use that space as a place to ask questions and make comments, and just to participate really throughout the session. We do have a Padlet page for this series. We've been doing this now for two or three. It's our third school year to be doing the series. And all of the sessions from the previous series are posted there at that Padlet. So that's a great place to go and find information about all of the previous sessions in this series. You can access that via either the QR code or the web link. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our presenter for this month, and that is going to be Danny with the East Tennessee Historical Society.
All right, thanks, Kira. Hey, everybody, my name is Danny, and as she said, I'm the Education Program Manager at the East Tennessee Historical Society. I started here in July of 2022, so just last year. And my role is largely working with K through 12 school groups, running any sort of family programming at ETHS events, and now doing teacher professional development as well. So I'm very excited to be here with you guys today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. And today we're going to be talking about the power of place. So this is something that has been a very popular topic throughout the last few months, years in the museum field and in public history. And it's something that we've really seen become a bigger and bigger topic, especially post-COVID. For a little bit of additional background on myself, I'm from Texas originally. I am still very much learning East Tennessee and Tennessee history. But prior to working here, I have experience with the education team at Colvin Run Mill Historic Site in Great Falls, Virginia. I've also worked for the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Reston Historic Trust and Museum, and the National Park Service. So I bounced around. I've been a little bit busy, but my experience here with ETHS has been largely obviously based here in East Tennessee. So before I start completely rambling on everything, I want to hear a little bit from you guys. So if you can get in the chat box or unmute yourself and let me know where you teach, what grade you teach, and which grand division of East Tennessee or of Tennessee you live in. Let me see if I can get to a point where I can see the chat.
Sometimes it's hard to see the chat, so we can always share it too.
There we go. Yeah, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, because I'm not able to see it as well.
So Kira's saying there are a number of Middle Tennessee folks in the crowd. I have someone that's taught 6th grade in Middle Tennessee. Eric is St. Clair and Mooresburg Elementary, K-5 in East Tennessee. Kayla teaches at a small school in Harrogate. She teaches everything from 8th to seniors in high school. Cool. Primarily teaches science, but incorporates history a lot. So another East Tennessean. And again, a number of folks that are Middle Tennessee. So
Alrighty, so a little bit of representation from those two grand divisions. We're glad to hear it. So what we're going to be looking at today is, like I said earlier, power of place. We're going to start with just sort of some big general questions. So if you're going to be typing in the chat box, feel free again to unmute and just actually share, because it might be a little bit easier for everybody. But if you want to just type, that's fine as well. First of all, is just, why is visiting historic sites important? I know the knee-jerk reaction there is to just be like, well, yes, of course it's important, but I really want to dig into the why and think about how these places are significant and how we designate what counts as significant.
So Kayla says history is significant because without knowing our background, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Mhm.
Understanding the larger physical context of a place. What Kira shared. And I think from my perspective, from Lisa's perspective, it just makes it more personal. You can connect a little bit by being at a historic place.
Sure.
Eric's saying connecting written history with an actual location. So the primary source documents can kind of be brought alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, physically being there kind of helps cut through the noise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lets you get down to a bit more of the heart of what you're talking about.
That's what Kelly says too. Says it helps you think about how the folks who were present for the event actually experienced it. And Nikki says they're our largest artifact.
That's absolutely right. They're an object that, a museum can't necessarily encapsulate, right? Yeah. If you have been anywhere that's been particularly impactful, either a historic site or just a place that you thought was impactful, go ahead, share it for me. Let's see. Doesn't necessarily have to be history. It could be a different type of museum. It could be a place like a stadium or a park.
Kira mentions Dachau concentration camp. Eric's Bull Run battlefield. It was a lot smaller than he thought it was. Sometimes size, it is amazing. Stories are so big, and then when you go in the place, it doesn't meet what your expectation was. And LMU's Abraham Lincoln Museum, Pinson Mounds, Old Stone Fort at Craig Font. Ephesus, Walnut Canyon in Arizona. Indigenous populations inhabited the cliffs. So nice.
Little
variety.
did y'all know I'm just polling you for vacation ideas. All right, so a lot of different places, right? They can all be impactful for different reasons. And thinking about this, and I promise I'll be done asking y'all questions here in a minute, but thinking about that experience, what made it impactful for you? Was it the fact that you had a personal connection, or you had a really good interpreter that got you really excited about it? What makes a site impactful? Anything?
Let's see, Kira says at Dachau, it was just a very solemn experience. Like you
Mhm.
could feel the weight of what had happened there. Kayla says a lot of it for me is remembering the people and the lives that once walked through these mountains, the things they saw, and just realizing one day we will be those people in the past. So it's almost like an internalizing,
Mhm.
and you reflect. And I think, and again, this is Lisa's perspective. I think kids respond that way too. If you can get them to stop long enough and pause.
Yeah.
Nikki says good interpretation and feeling the presence of the past through these conversations in the actual setting. So interpretation does matter. Eric
Mhm.
says how historical sites are influenced by modern environments.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. All right. Very cool. So taking all of,
Lin- let me just add what Lindsay said. So that's everybody. Ephesus
thanks, guys.
Ephesus was impactful because religious knowledge and to see these ancient cities from the Bible still around was very moving. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of times things are impactful to us because they draw upon our emotions, right? They draw upon either a shared humanity or something that makes it easier to connect with the people who were there at that time. Um, so when we're taking students to these historic places, obviously we're just going to have to I'm a very practical logistics person. So as soon as I think field trips, I start thinking like buses and permission slips and all the kind of minutia that gets us to the field trip and everything. So for right now, we're just going to kind of box that up, put it aside, pretend that you can misfrizzle your students out of anything, and you get on the Magic School Bus and go wherever you want to teach about whatever topic you're trying to, impart some wisdom on. Taking students on field trips, I think I've been on more field trips as an adult since being, in college and since graduating than I ever did as a school student. I grew up in a very small town in Texas. We did not get out a whole lot. But I do remember anytime we would go on a field trip to a place, it always meant a lot more whenever I had a little bit of context to understand why we were there. Obviously, you schedule a field trip a long way in advance, and you may or may not actually get there in the curriculum. But providing a little bit of context and being able to share that with students before you actually get to the place is obviously going to go a long way. So there's one particular experience that I'm going to be talking to you guys about today, and it was actually something that I got to do before I started working here. So in June of last year, I got to tag along on the 2002 Teacher Institute, which was funded by Humanities Tennessee. And we got to spend about 2.5 days in and around Southeast Tennessee, Northwest Georgia, learning about the Cherokee removal. Now, like I said, I'm from Texas. A lot of my experience with the Cherokee is not here in their original homelands. I have more experience with them in Oklahoma and seeing casinos and different things out there. So this was an experience for me that was good for learning, and that I had to kind of build myself some context before we were able to go on this trip. So what you see on the screen here was the agenda for that trip. We went to 5 different sites and then had half a day of kind of reflection and learning about how to share what we had learned with students. So this Teacher Institute, it was hot. We went in June. It was about 95, 100 degrees every day. But despite that, I think everyone was still very engaged with the content, with the sites, and really you were able to sort of forget your own discomfort and reaching back into the past and learning about these people in this time period. So has anybody been to any of these sites before? Other than Lisa and Kira, because y'all were on the trip.
Eric has not.
Okay.
And Kira says actually June was the first time that she'd been to all of the sites.
Yeah.
So it was a first time visit. And I will say Teaching with Primary Sources was our partner
That's right.
on that
Mhm.
Humanities Tennessee project. Kelly says she went to several as a student because she grew up in Southeast Tennessee. So it would be interesting. Yeah, it would be interesting if she'd been with us to see how her experience would compare to as an adult.
Yeah.
And that's all we have so far.
Okay, cool. Well, it was my first time at all of these sites. And I think largely what was very impactful was the fact that they all told stories and histories of the same time period, but in each one you see it through a slightly different lens. Now, obviously, with students, you're not necessarily going to get to do a 2-day long field trip like this, where you get to go to multiple sites, see multiple perspectives, learn multiple facets of the story, but you can replicate something like this by pairing a visit to New Echota or to Chief Van House with primary source documents that go with some of these other places. You can even throw some objects in there if you really want to get fun with it, which we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So visiting all of these sites and seeing all these different interpretations of the same time period was really instructional and really insightful, especially learning how the historiography has evolved over the course of even the last 20 years. So the way that we talk about the Cherokee people, the way that the places that were very important to them have been interpreted has changed. We've started to finally put the Cherokee voice first and actually understand that these are their stories to tell and this is their history, which was very apparent at some sites, and other sites were definitely still kind of catching up. So as you're planning field trips, that is something to look into as well, as to see where is the site in their journey of growing their interpretation and sharing a more complete version of what happened. So like I said, we were there, all these sites for about 2 days, and over the course of the 2 days, so all the teachers that came to this, I think only a few of them actually knew each other ahead of time. So you have that little dynamic that needs to develop, right? So over the course of the 2 days, by having these shared experiences, our teachers actually got to a point where they were working really well together and working cohesively as a group through these shared experiences. So the last site that we visited was this one here, which was the Blythe Ferry Cherokee Removal Memorial Park. If I were just to be out on a wander of this part of Tennessee and saw this before going on this trip, I would have been like, hey, that looks like a really great place to launch my paddleboard and hang out for an afternoon. Not having any context, not having any awareness of the site itself. Now looking at it, this was one of our last stops, and this was actually an area where they would have been the last time that the Cherokee people who were being removed, where some of them would have actually seen the land that was theirs, the land their ancestors were on. It was a very poignant site and a very impactful moment that wouldn't necessarily have landed the same if we hadn't been doing everything that we'd done over the course of the previous couple days. So this particular site was obviously one that we lingered at for a little bit to kind of take it in and understand it. And if you're wondering, as I would have been, why we're looking at a boat dock for how the Cherokee were removed west, there's another previous webinar by Amy Costine that talks about all the different transportation methods that were used to remove the Cherokee people and that they used to remove themselves. So going to all of these sites and having these experiences was obviously very eye-opening, and a lot of the outcomes of the program were kind of reflected in that last half day of conversation and reflection. We walked away from it with a greater sense of historical empathy. So a lot of things that we learned about during this 2.5 days of programming were beyond the scope of what any textbook is going to be able to say about these topics, right? We heard from various experts. We talked to different interpreters at these sites. Kira and Amy provided primary sources for us to look at that provided, again, greater context for what we were going to be seeing and doing. But really what everyone walked away from it was a sense of greater compassion and greater empathy for, the people who went through this. And, that's something that can be kind of hard to foster if you're just in the classroom, right? Because you're not able to really provide the full experience of standing in the place where these people stood and looking out and realizing that, this is actually something that really and truly happened. I think it's easy sometimes when you're, going through a history textbook to not really desensitize, but to not acknowledge as much that there is a connection here and that these things truly happened to people. And I think actually standing in the site and visiting those sites can really help with fostering that empathy, both in adults and in students, right? Another big outcome was the increased awareness of the scope of the removal. Looking at it from, various Cherokee perspectives, from the perspectives of the U.S. military, from different politicians' perspectives, it really provided a greater, I'll say scope again, that's close enough, a greater scope. So it really was a much larger basis of information because we were able to, like I said, go to these places and see these things firsthand. Improve the context surrounding the standards. The state standards are going to be, there's a lot of them, right? So they can't be as in-depth and specific as necessarily you would want them to go. Having a little bit more context to teach the standards within and to use when explaining why these topics are important to students can be really helpful. Finally, increased appreciation for how historic sites can be used as teaching tools. And that's where we come back to power of place. So historic sites, museums, places of cultural significance, for the most part, we're here to help. We are here to provide interpretation. We're here to support ongoing education. But really, we're here to show that, while we don't necessarily always put very much emphasis on history, it is still very important and it's still available to you as a resource. There are a lot of really neat little sites that I feel should be shared more broadly, especially like this one that we were at here. This one actually, those pillars that you can see in the back here, they actually listed all, I believe it was all the names of the Cherokee people who were removed from different areas. And I don't think it was just in East Tennessee, but I think it was in that whole region. So, all right. So let's say that you do get all the funding in line and everything is all hunky-dory and you're able to take your students to historic sites. Well, obviously you want them to have a positive experience. You want them to have a good learning experience and to enjoy themselves too, because we want education to be fun and enjoyable because it sticks better that way. So when you're planning trips, it can be really valuable to reach out and try to talk directly to the education team. I know if you book a field trip with us, odds are 9 out of 10 times, even if you fill out the form perfectly and everything like that, you will end up on the phone with me at some point because I want to make sure that I'm providing the absolute best experience for your students, and also that I am aware of where y'all are and in what ways I can be most helpful. Additionally, just understanding where they are programmatically from the historiography aspect that I was talking about before. So seeing if it is a group that is providing the history and talking about history in a way that is cohesive with your teaching methods and also with what your students are learning. All right. Last thing I would say, make sure that your kids feel comfortable asking questions. There's nothing worse than getting back on the bus after a field trip and then suddenly getting inundated with questions because your students didn't ask them while you were there. That's a really big thing. And that's something that I know I did to my teachers growing up, which I feel bad about because I had all those resources right there and didn't understand what I was doing and why I wasn't using them properly. All right. So let's say things go the other way. You're not able to get permission forms. You're not able to, get your students out to these historic sites, or there's ones that are related to something that you want to talk about, but they're too far away, anything like that. This is where things like primary sources, like we talked about earlier, or using object-based lessons can be really helpful. So like I said, we had primary sources provided for several of the sites that we visited. There are resources available both regionally here in East Tennessee through us, or statewide through State Library and Archives, like the Docs boxes, that can help you kind of go deeper on a lot of these topics without necessarily physically going to a site. There's also, and I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about this, there are various VR platforms that you can use to visit different sites. I know some schools have funding for them, some schools don't. This is something that I'm hoping to learn more about in my time here. A couple last things I wanted to mention, and teacher resources for you guys through us, through the Historical Society. We have our Teach Tennessee History website, which covers a ton of different information. We have lesson plans, we have primary sources, all sorts of material that is there available for you guys to use. We also have our student programming section on our main website if you're interested in booking a field trip here, or if you're in East Tennessee in one of our 35 counties and want me to come to you, I can do that. We can provide object-based lessons to you guys. Additionally, we have National History Day at the bottom there. This is a great way for your students to get involved in history if they want to dig a little bit deeper than they're getting to in the classroom. All right. Any questions?
Kayla says, as a student, she did National History Day and it was so much fun. And Danny's going to have her first History Day season. We are the coordinators, as she said, of the East Tennessee region, and Nikki is doing an incredible job as state coordinator of kind of getting all the regional competitions underway. And I will just say that all of these sites, all of these resources that we learned about over the summer, I could think of so many different ways to utilize those in National History Day research projects to many different themes. So I really encourage you to think about place-based history and historic sites as secondary resources and leads for primary sources. But I would say, as Danny did, what's really important though, before they get to that point, is that they do some secondary source reading, what they talk about in the textbook, prepare with some context and understanding so that they can really know what questions to ask and go not just new to the topic to historic site, or if they're doing research on a particular project. And Kira was an incredible resource. She pulled together a lot of the strategy sessions for what we were doing, especially on the second day. And there's a really powerful word cloud activity she did. And I asked her if she could pull up what the teachers came up with and how they kind of reflected. It was sort of an assessment and a reflection activity. So Kira, if you have those handy, maybe you could share them. And again, this goes back to the Trail of Tears project that we did.
Yeah, so yeah, I used a tool, and of course you guys can use this too, or you may have others that you're using, but we used Poll Everywhere to do this. Wait, hold on. Oops, if I share my screen. So we actually posed two questions to our teachers. So the first one, and here, let me move this where you guys can see it a little bit bigger. All right, so the first question we asked them was just to submit kind of, using one word for a word cloud, something, a term that helped them to kind of summarize what, some things that stood out to them about the history of the Trail of Tears that we had learned over the course of the couple days. And so, of course, you guys, you're familiar with how word clouds work. The more that a word is submitted, the larger that word gets in your word cloud. And so you can see here that, the three things that really stood out to people in their summaries was the term strong, survivors, and perspective. And then of course you can see some of the others. So yeah, I think what you would like to do is just kind of give you guys a chance to kind of reflect on some of these terms and how the sites might have actually drew out these words and these connections. And if Lisa and Danny, if you guys have any thoughts on, your own experiences and how these words, how this kind of connects back to your own experiences from the summer.
Well, and I think if you, going back to what Danny was saying and what everybody's reflected about being on a historic site, being in a place, it just engages different elements of your thought process, of your education, how you learn. But I think if you look at these words, can you just imagine, could a lecture, or reading in a textbook, can you imagine that all of these different words would come from that? Or how many of these words do you imagine are coming from an experience or engaging with something that's beyond just, reading something? And whether it's virtually done, whether it's something that you're sharing, because you may have visited yourself and you can't take the students, but capturing that experience. Like Danny said, maybe you visit one place and then you bring in other kinds of elements in it, primary sources and all in the classroom. I just think that's where you begin to get into these other types of powerful words. And again, as I put in the chat, just the whole idea of historical empathy. I had never really thought about the concept of historical empathy in terms of my education efforts, of what I'm trying to engender, but I think that's a good vocabulary to use. And Nikki's said, Google Earth is a great alternative if funding isn't there or you teach something ancient. My students could visit present day Athens from the classroom. Seeing the place humanizes history, especially for younger learners. But the other thing I loved about this activity was it was a great way to assess it's not really something you can quantify, but it's a qualitative sort of assessment, a good way for everybody to have their voice too. Whether they feel like that they're verbal in sharing what something means to them. I really like this tool of that Kira used as an assessment piece, and I'll let Danny follow up with anything she's thinking.
Yeah, I think this, the word cloud in particular, I think the part that really kind of emphasizes the importance of being able to actually visit places is the fact that the word perspective is one of the biggest ones. I think it is one of those things that when you're reading about it, it's just another chapter, just another couple pages you're trying to get through, whatever reading you have, and being able to actually stand and take a moment to just look around and realize that you are actually where these things happened. That sense of perspective isn't necessarily something that you get, even reading or watching a video about a place. There's a lot of power in actually being somewhere, and being able to, take in the surroundings, hear the sounds, and just generally understand where these things occurred. Especially since a lot of these historic places have been preserved, right? There are some here in Knoxville itself, like Blunt Mansion and James White's Fort, that, the city's kind of grown up around them, but the actual footprint of the place is still preserved and still there. A lot of the places that we went on this trip, like Red Clay, are, out preserved there, where you can actually still hear birds and walk around and see, the water flowing through. And it really provides a very, it's a calming environment for you to take in kind of the experience of learning about the place. And then also, like I said earlier, empathizing a bit more with the people who live there.
Well, both of you.
Are you going to go to your next step? because
Yeah, I was
that's
going to
where
show
it
the other one.
really,
Yeah.
that's where you really see the difference, I think. And it wasn't, and I really think it was the difference. And let me just say that the Historical Society has many years now experience of doing on-site visit-oriented travel institutes. And this is the reason why we keep going back to it, is because of this element of place-based experience. And we're committed to it because we've seen it work. And so now I think you will see the big difference it makes when she shows you the
Wow.
other image. Hopefully we get
If
to
I
that.
can get to it. This is where was this one
Yeah, there you go.
where we just looked at. All right, so this is the other
There you
one.
go.
Sorry, this is where Zoom sometimes hides tabs from you. So yeah, so this is the terms when we looked at the curriculum standards that show up for the Trail of Tears. So in 4th, 8th, and then the high school Tennessee history course, these were the terms that people use to summarize the content that's in the curriculum standards. And so you can think about the words that we just looked at when we think about the overall way we wanted to summarize after we had saw these sites and seen the interpretation there versus how we would summarize it based on what we see within the curriculum standards. And I think you can get a sense of just the difference.
And it's not to say that, I mean, y'all are incredible educators. You can bring things alive in your classrooms. And that's not to say that that's not possible to do. It's just to say that this is an option to work into that toolkit if you can, or to bring the experience in. I think it just shows you what taking that extra step, you know, in one of those directions to, you know, engage in a different way, to add something into your instruction and it's also more fun for the teacher. And I think we're preaching to the choir, right? You all have already had great experiences of places that you've been, that you've shared. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that sometimes we actually have had experiences ourselves as individuals, that the kids can benefit from, just from that we've already done or have kind of in our memory or in our file somewhere. That's a good place to start too.
See, I think, you know, to me, the word here that pops out that I think gives us that, you know, emphasis of why play space can be so important compared to, again, just reading what's in our textbook, as we can bring that in, is that word sterile. Because, you know, there's just a different layer to things when you can bring in a place, or if you can bring in primary sources, it gives students a different way to engage with the history beyond, you know, just the, you know, sometimes not so exciting way that the stories are presented in their history books. And gives them a way to connect with that, you know, really can engage them in a way that make them interested. And I think that's what we most want, is for our kids to be interested in what we're talking about.
I think one reason that a lot of the place-based experiences that I had, you know, growing up and in undergrad and grad school and stuff were really impactful was because for the first time I could actually see myself represented in a lot of these places, in a lot of these spaces, especially, you know, if you hear 1,000,001 Civil War stories, it's nice to go to a place where I can be like, well, what were the women doing? What were the enslaved people doing? What else was going on? Because it wasn't just battles and things, like there was still a home front then. So a lot of the places give you a bit more leeway to talk about some of these other, you know, not as commonly discussed topics and areas in history. And that's where kids can get really excited. I wasn't a huge fan of history growing up because it was mostly like names, dates, and famous white men, which, you know, important. Glad I know it, but it was hard to get engaged with it because I didn't see myself or the people that I cared about or the stories that I was interested in reflected in what I was learning.
Well, I had dropped in the chat today, just by, for example, just by happenstance, the National Council of History Education had sent out their newsletter, and in that was actually a listing for place-based learning resources. So I dropped that link into the chat box, but they listed multiple different historic sites that, offer some sort of virtual tour. So again, even if you can't physically get there, they offer some sort of virtual option to give you that kind of place-based experience. I think that's a really cool tool that, again, there are lots of different ways that you can bring that into the classroom. And that was just a listing of a few places that had that.
Mhm. And the virtual experiences could be really cool, especially if you find ones that, kind of can walk you through room by room, either through a museum or through a historic home, and you can kind of get through and zoom in and look at objects a little bit more closely and stuff like that. It can be pretty engaging. There's one that I'm trying to think of, and if I remember it, I'll pass it along. But it's a historic home, and you can actually go through and like zoom in on the individual objects and get a little kind of synopsis of what the object is, what it was used for. It was somewhere in Maryland. I'll have to look it up, but there are a lot of really good virtual options. That's one of the few good things I think that came out of COVID, was that we actually started investing in that as a field.
I don't know if it's the one, I know Montpelier has that, I think, for their house tour, but I think it's more decorative arts based, what they've actually, the tour that they have. I don't think it's more historical narrative as much as it is decorative arts.
Yeah, the one I'm thinking of has it's gonna drive me crazy. I can't remember it. It has a VR component too that you can like put on a headset and actually walk through the house. It was very, very well done. I'll have to look it up. Well, does anyone have any? Google Arts and Culture is another. Yep. Another good way to find those. Any other comments, questions, thoughts on the topic of, being able to take your students to historic places, scientific places, places where, you're getting to further expand on the classroom component?
Well, I know another way that teachers have shared with, with us over the years that they sort of do this is, on their own time in the summers, they take their own trips or they do workshops. They create their own kind of virtual experiences for their kids through just, images that they take, resources that they pick up. And so that's something else to think about is, if you can't physically take your students somewhere that you've been, do you have materials to create that experience for them that you could bring to the classroom?
Yeah.
Another thing to think about might be just for the kids to kind of imagine and find sources to create a space and place within the classroom that they might imagine would be from a time period. And maybe that's context. Maybe they do that before they go to visit somewhere, is they read about, they read about a topic or a place or an event or a person, and then they just kind of brainstorm a little bit. Well, I wonder, what would the environment have been like? What would a house have been like that they would have lived in? And that might be a neat little research project before they take that trip, or to decide where maybe the students want to think about where they might like to go and visit when they're researching something, because with the virtual world, they could reach out and go a lot of different places. So sometimes it could be student directed. And Eric says, oh, you can see it now. I don't have to read it. So I'll let Danny read it.
So they like scavenger hunts, groups or individually, QR codes and scanning bits of information. I'm glad to hear you say that, Eric, because we have a program like that here at the museum, and they do a virtual escape room where they get to go through our galleries and, answer questions, find things. We have it set up so that they can race against each other time-wise. And that it is something that's very popular with our older students in particular. Another thing to think about too is, I think a lot of times we can kind of fall into the trap of like, well, history didn't happen here, or that's something that I've fallen into before. I grew up in a very small town in Texas, and literally until today, I had no idea why that town was there. And then I was getting ready for this webinar and I went, I could probably Google and figure out why my hometown, exists. So that's something too, if you're looking for a student project, is to have them look into the history of their own place and be like, hey, why is the town of Farragut here? Why is it named that? Who came here first? Like what's the history of this actual place? Because everywhere that there were people, there is a place that is important. And it's not that it's easy to fall into the trap of being like, oh, well, I'm from here and nothing exciting has ever happened here. Well, it's not necessarily true. So having them lean into the history of their own place can be really impactful and empowering as well. Because if you know where you're from, you have something to talk about and something to share.
And I will add to that, one great way to do that is to use, Chronicle America with Library of Congress has a lot of our
Mhm.
local newspapers, and that's a great way for kids to do research about their hometowns. Yeah, and Kelly mentioned the Tennessee Encyclopedia, also a great resource to get those local stories.
And I would just say too, reach out to your local library because they oftentimes they may know someone that they could suggest that, loves local history and loves kids that would be interested in partnering with you to do some things. But also most libraries have like a little local history section or a clippings file, and you might find an interesting something to work with. Census records are incredible too, to work with the
Mhm.
census record.
All right. Well, if no one has anything else, I think we can get to our kind of wrap up section. Thank you guys so much for sharing this with us. And again, just a reminder, we will have resources here on the Padlet page that you can access that way. If you're interested in receiving, wait, before we get to that, next month we will be back with the Tennessee State Parks with a session on assessing Tennessee's history through our state park system. So definitely register to join us for that, which will be on the second Tuesday of February at 4 p.m. Central Time, of course, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And again, if you're interested in receiving PD credit for today, please be sure to fill out the survey using this link here. I'm going to give you a QR code on the next screen over in just a second. We send out the certificates about once a week. So again, fill those out. That is how you will receive PD credit for viewing this session today. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any questions, for those of you who are joining us live, feel free to stay on and we will be happy to answer those. So thank you guys and have a great day.